Thank you, Jack, for coming on and joining me on the show today. I really appreciate you taking the time. You are the founder of Visualize Value, prolific creator of quality content from images, videos, tweets, complete courses, podcasts, all sorts of visuals, and just basically anything you can imagine. If it's content you're doing and you're doing it really well at a high quality. So it's great to have you on, talk about how you built this brand and how you got to where you are. I think the first thing, if you could start just by sort of telling your story for those who don't know you, as early as you're willing to start to where you are today and how you made some of those decisions along the way.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me, mate. I'll do my best to rewind the most relevant parts as well. So, grew up in Southwest England, small town, well, reasonably small town by American standards, and was kind of didn't really have I think a lot of people look back at their childhood and they see like things that they love to do or hobbies or like things that they were like showed an interest in really early on. I don't see anything like really standing out there that I can kind of point to as an early indicator. I think one of the most influential things that happened to me in my early life was in the UK at 16 you have to do work experience. So normally the school will kind of give you a set of options to pick from, random jobs, and the list that I got given I was pretty uninspired by. And I knew my cousin worked in a design agency. This is like, what year would this have been? A long time ago, like early 2000s. And I asked him if I could go and kind of spend a week up in the design agency and see how that worked. And up to that point, like all of my part-time jobs and things had been things that I wasn't necessarily looking forward to doing for the rest of my life. Worked on building sites, worked like sweeping up the floor in a hairdresser's, worked in industrial shredders, just all sorts of weird stuff that I got exposed to, summer jobs, mowing lawns, things like that. And so I went to this graphic design studio and kind of was blown away by the fact that people did this for a living. So both my parents were in the military, so like their recounting of their careers was very different than sitting in a design studio doing creative work and kind of letting your imagination take you to places. That was definitely much more of like not the vision of work that I grew up around. So got exposure to that for a week and then kind of went back and finished the rest of school. I studied graphic design a couple of years after that for that reason, because I'd been kind of exposed to it in earlier on. So I spent 3 years. I studied it in Cardiff in Wales, which is about an hour from where I grew up. And that was kind of a 3-year course. Met a bunch of great people, had a great time at university. Wasn't a particularly talented designer going in. It's not a great school either by the if you look at any kind of official rankings, but spent 3 years there, kind of learned enough to come out and apply for some internships. And as soon as I graduated, I was applying for whatever work I could get that was even remotely related to graphic design, and managed to get an unpaid internship in London, which is again about another hour in the other direction from where I grew up, and was doing like a 2.5-hour commute each way for 3 months to an unpaid internship in London. Worked on some cool projects. This was like back when you had to design websites in Photoshop and have like a team of 15 people building them and troubleshooting them, and very different from what that looks like now. So kind of got into the design industry when I wouldn't say like web design and app design were taken off, but definitely like I think learned a bit more of the kind of how to design a system from scratch, how to build a design system from scratch. From there, really weird and random story. Met a couple guys in a pub one night, and they had a friend who could get cheap tickets to New York, and I took them up on that. Went to New York, applied for like 200 jobs on Craigslist. I just Googled like design internships, New York. Figured that I should meet people if I'm going to go out to New York. Never did the traveling thing or the gap year thing. A lot of my friends did. So I kind of had an itch to do something different, and got one response. There's a guy running an agency in West Chelsea in New York who I sent my university portfolio to him. And he said, yeah, come out, we'll meet and I'll kind of show you the ropes and things. And he like took a big chance, I would say, and got me a visa. And I just started, kind of the T boy for a couple of years in New York, in this tiny agency, 5 or 6 people, worked on more traditional design stuff, worked on TV campaigns, magazines. This is 2011. So still that era where like design, like all of the tools that we have now didn't exist. So a lot of those processes are way more involved, and spent then like the next 10 years just bouncing around agency jobs. So from little agencies, I worked in big digital consultancies that were kind of like big 4 consulting competitors with an agency tacked on the side. Worked at a couple small startups. I worked at Bloomberg for a little while. Probably 8, 9, 10 jobs in the course of 10 years, just all in the creative agency environment. Was a designer, art director, picked up a little bit of experience in a lot of different areas, do my own copywriting, write strategy, build pitch decks, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to a point in maybe late 2017, I was still working at an agency and kind of been exposed to enough of the agency environment that I thought, oh, I get the economics of this now. I can do this by myself. And I always kind of refer back to this as like kind of a moment of, it's like a leap of faith, but there's also like a high degree of arrogance in there. Like you're the, one person touching the work. It obviously takes dozens of people to deliver a project that, you're working with a Fortune 500 brand or whatever. And my like naive understanding of it was, well, I'm doing the design work, so why don't I capture, more of the upside than I'm capturing? So I could obviously extrapolate what I'm getting paid versus what the agency is getting paid to do the job. And that was really my misunderstanding of how much of the job is really just politics and, answering emails all day and all of the stuff that you don't really want to do as a creative person. That infrastructure has to exist for you to be able to do your job and interact with companies of this size. Anyway, started my own agency and basically went the same route, just tried to build a leaner, better version of the companies that I'd worked at in the past, and quickly realized that's just not necessarily not possible, not something that I was willing to do. Just again, you have to kind of absorb the inefficiency of these massive businesses. I did it for a year or so. I was in my mid-20s, so it was, or late 20s-ish. So it was kind of had the energy for it. And then after a year or so, I was just burned out. And that's where Visualize Value started to, I guess, find, I found, or there's a few threads that came together that made Visualize Value exist. One of them was just this realization that after running my own agency, I'd realized like the really valuable part of the process was the ability to pitch, the ability to like distill a narrative into a document, walk into a room and explain what the vision for this thing was. And so Visualize Value originally was a service business that did that as a service. So outside of the marketing world, though, for product owners or people building technology companies that had a hard time explaining what it is their product does, I just started working with clients exclusively on like, the only deliverable we're going to do here is, 5 visuals and a keynote and a story that lets you explain what you do really succinctly. And then that just did that probably for another year, and then started to create content as a lead magnet for that service business. So I'd post these really simple distillations of concepts as visuals on social. Started on Twitter. One of the like revelations in hindsight about using Twitter is like being able to essentially coast off the audiences of other people. So reading a book that somebody contributed to, finding an idea in there that's worth visualizing, and then tagging that person on Twitter, and then they amplify the thing. You get more eyes on your work. I got more inbound requests for agency work. And then eventually reached a point where I couldn't fulfill the agency work that was coming my way. So I had to start thinking about a different model. And that's where the education component came in. So built a couple of curriculums. One is about design. The other is about essentially transitioning from a service business owner or a specialized creative person into, somebody who can use digital, whether it's media, code, whatever it might be, to package your experience into products and scale beyond just the number of hours in the day. And then Visualize Value has just been kind of chugging along, doing, experimenting with a lot of different things in the last couple of years. The course business is alive and well, but I've also been kind of dipping my toes in industries that I think benefit most from the idea of Visualize Value. So crypto has been a focus of mine for probably the last 18 months, 2 years. Just trying to bring clarity to these complex ideas that people seem to not necessarily, well, people seem to struggle to explain or understand. So that's like, in one way that's like a continuous source of inspiration for material for Visualize Value, but it's also it's hard to put a stake in the ground, if that makes sense. So yeah, and today it's kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different things, working on, as you said, content, doing some podcasts outside of that, and making art, trying to get some physical products going. It's a little bit of everything.
Awesome. Well, appreciate you sharing the full story going way back, and really interesting to hear some of those details that, having listened to a bunch of podcasts that you did with other people and read a bunch of your content on Twitter and long form and everything like that. I hadn't heard quite a bit of that. So it was interesting to get sort of the, the long version. Couple points that I think would be interesting to plug in, thinking of where to start. I guess going way back, you mentioned, I think you were 16, you had to get a job for school or something like that. I actually didn't realize that was a thing in the UK, but
yeah. It's a government mandated program. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's like a week long or something like that, you said?
Yeah. I think it was 5 days. May have been like a week and a half, something like that. But you had to like get in and experience a working environment and then write about it and, go back to school and do a little presentation.
Yeah, it's probably not a bad idea. I mean, a lot of people, I think, at least in the US, maybe don't start working early enough, maybe, and sort of seeing, learning the value of the dollar and things like that. You certainly weren't late getting into the game. It sounds like you had a few experiences even before that, doing sort of, menial type stuff and just making a buck over the summer or whatever. But the question I was going to ask was like, you got into this design thing at 16 with the 1 week stint or week and a half, whatever it was, with your friend or your cousin. And, your parents, you mentioned, were like military backgrounds. So it's pretty, out there. And you didn't mention anything prior that really like sparked any interest in design. Seems like maybe it just sort of happened and you got there and realized you really liked it. And I'm curious, like, if you can recall, from those earliest days being sort of exposed to this new thing and this possibility of like doing creative work for potentially a long time, what was like the most, what was really intriguing and enjoyable, I guess, about it then? And you've been doing it for some version of it for 15 or 20 years now, whatever it's been. I don't want to date you, but I think like 15 years or so.
15's about right.
And obviously things have changed. The whole, what you're doing has changed, how you're doing it has changed. You're sort of your own boss now, whereas before you were just getting your start. So a lot's changed, but I'm curious if there's, something you enjoyed back then that has persisted to this day as like one of your favorite aspects, or if
Yeah, yeah.
something new has sort of emerged as, what's keeping you interested these days.
Yeah, actually, that question makes me think about a few things that I left out of the story I told. So I was actually working. So I did that work experience at 16, and then when I came out of school, it didn't immediately occur to me to go and study design. I got a job straight out of school. I worked in a print like a print factory. They would basically do like millions and millions of the flyers that like fall out of newspapers. That was their thing. I got a job as an account executive somehow. I forget exactly how that came about. Applied for basically every job in the newspaper, I think, and it like that job was pretty soul crushing. I remember like my job was basically to ring people and say, "Hey, we messed this up, or this is going to be late, or we got the print color wrong on XYZ." So it was just kind of damage control. I wasn't doing anything creative. I was just kind of inserted in the bureaucracy of this like poorly run business. And I remember actually, it's weird that I didn't bring this up as a catalyst. I remember one of their clients was a graphic design magazine, and I think it's called Graphic with a K. And it was just this beautiful object, like 50 different types of paper. Like the care that went into assembling this thing was so much greater than everything else that was being produced in that factory or that printers, whatever you want to call it. And I think that was kind of that maybe lit something back up where I was like, wow, like people do this for a living. And obviously somebody somewhere is sitting in front of a computer designing this thing. And that environment sounds a lot more appealing than the one that I'm currently in. And after that, I got a job at Honda. So the town I grew up in, one of their biggest employers is Honda. They have a factory there, build Civics and CRVs. And I was working on the production line there. And a lot of my friends had gone to university. And I think one day I was just like, man, I should try and do design. I didn't think I had you have to apply to university in the UK same way as probably everywhere. I'm not sure how rigorous it is in the States, but you have to have like a certain amount of points and credits and think I was a terrible student. So the university thing was kind of not something I thought was open to me for a long time. But then I just thought I'll just apply anyway. So I'd get home late from these shifts working at a car factory, and I'll do like just I can't even remember now where I got the ideas from, but just like making these little mock-ups of ideas, and had to build a portfolio to apply to university. So I was kind of looking at the application process and trying to reverse engineer it. And then I applied to a bunch of schools, got into one. But to your question, so I rambled a little bit, but I think the idea of proof of work, or the idea of building a portfolio and being able to look back at the stuff that you've created, was like the thing that's really, I think was like a profound realization for me. It's not like you're walking into an office every day and you're like, you feel like your effort is just like bleeding into the ether. Like you're doing damage control, you're on the phone, blah, blah. For some people, I think maybe they get, you get a level of satisfaction from that, but I definitely didn't. I think that idea of building a body of work started to speak to me, and having that process proven through like being accepted into a university, however easy it was to get in, just the fact that I made this stuff out of nothing and sent it into them and they accepted me was a bit of a game changer. And then that idea has just stayed true throughout my design career. And that's what a design career is, right? It's like you can only jump around to different places of employment by showing a book of work that you've produced and be able to speak to it intelligently. So that like always has stuck with me, and that's still how visualized value functions to this day. It's like the business is only as good as the proof that I can put out into the world. And I was obviously, as I mentioned, a terrible student. And I didn't have a great personal network. So it wasn't really a function of knowing the right people. It was more of a function of like make your work better, and then you'll be exposed to better opportunities. And there's obviously lots of people along the way that gave me a shot and turned me into, came out of those places a little bit better than I went in. But that theme throughout proof of work, just publishing, not even publishing in those days, just like making stuff and having it in a format that you can walk into a place and show it, was really you kind of take it for granted in the moment, but then when you get out of that, when you get out of the individual environment and look back, those have all been the catalysts for new opportunities. Like a project that I worked on that came out great, that I then showed in a different interview and moved to another place. And then obviously to win work as an agency, you have to show the work that you've already done. And there's just lots of little memories I have of even seeing people make stuff that they wanted to exist, in a design context, like, not necessarily waiting for a company to give you a brief or give you an ask. You just come up with a solution to something and then put it in front of them. And in many cases it works. So that was kind of I guess the shortcut, if there are any shortcuts, that was definitely something that started to resonate with me. And I started to use subconsciously for a long time. And then I think slowly became conscious of how useful of a device that is.
Yeah, I can definitely, sympathize just doing this podcast even and sort of recording episode after episode. And suddenly, I'm past 100 and I've got all these amazing people who've been on, and like looking back at that, it feels good to sort of have that collection, and it feels good to, have that public. And I think, when you started, obviously, you're doing some work and you're collecting your favorite pieces and you're going around with your portfolio, and in a given interview, you're showing what you did at your last couple of gigs and all your best work. But at a certain point, it seems like, I don't know exactly what the order was, but, maybe at some point you realized, hey, I should have this stuff up all the time to show anyone easily without having to hand them a folder. And I can have a website, and then, later I can have a Twitter. And then suddenly I have this huge, like, sort of, flywheel of just this brand that's spinning itself and getting new eyeballs, and my work. Every time I put something out in public, like, everyone sees it instead of having to go and collect my favorite pieces and show them and things like that. How did that transition sort of go over time when, it wasn't just collecting your favorite work anymore and, taking pride in your best stuff, but actually having that just default public? I'm assuming sort of that's how it is today.
Yeah, it definitely is. And public is an interesting way to think about it, because my portfolio website was always public, but there was no reason for anybody to look at it unless they were interviewing me for a job, which is, I haven't really thought deeply about this, so my answer might not be that eloquent, but I started to realize that towards the end of my own attempt at building an agency, was this didn't quite feel like it was compounding in the same way that even your reputation inside a company can compound. Like when you're out on your own and you're like, you do great creative work, it's if there's not some consistency in terms of like your focus or your message or your like if this is just a collection of commercial projects that you happen to be exposed to at various different jobs over the course of your life, rarely does that show like your very unique perspective. So I think the transition to visualized value was that it became like more of a magnet and more of a not to say that a creative portfolio doesn't show off your skill set and the way you think, but if the creative briefs that made that portfolio weren't like yours to choose in the first place, maybe it's not the best way to showcase your skill set or your point of view, in the same way that like this podcast, like you're reaching out to people who you have questions for as opposed to being assigned people to speak to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that would not be a good podcast.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you could do your best, but more often than not, like the product is going to lack because the level of interest and curiosity, et cetera, is not there, versus something that's self-directed where all of that tends to compound and it becomes this like really specific magnet for the types of people that appreciate the same things you do, which, again, you can form great working relationships that way. You can build things that people are going to be interested in. There's all sorts of amazing things that look like coincidences off the back of that, but they're really like a product of having a very specific focus.
Right. Yeah, I think people can argue whether, luck is blind or you can do things to make your own luck in a way. But I think, an example that I have from my past that sort of, I think is similar to what you were saying about your portfolio page. Like no one has reason to go there. And that's why it's helpful, I think, to like plug into a Twitter or some sort of, whether it's a network or whatever, somewhere where people can stumble upon you. Like no one will stumble upon like a domain name that doesn't get hits.
Exactly.
It's just, you can't really do it. So and it's interesting because I think it brings up the question of like one of my favorite visuals that you've done, and you're tweeting about it all the time, like keep going. You've got this visual, I think it says this is pointless at like a certain point where, it's like a bar chart and all the bars are really, small. And then this is pointless is like right before the point where everything starts to go vertical and you start to, take off. How do you know though, like, if you had just kept doing your domain name portfolio, or if I had kept doing my blog, probably, it's not really compounding, like it's not really working. You can keep going and keep going, but you're actually just going to sort of stay in this is pointless. Like you're never going to hit that escape velocity. And I think sometimes it's kind of hard to know. Like even myself, I have some listeners and things like that, but I still consider myself like pre-vertical in terms of, this is pointless, and I'm happy with what I'm doing. I'm gonna keep going for sure. But it's like, how do you know? Are there things you look for where it's like, sometimes keep going actually isn't the right advice? Like sometimes it's like, well, actually, stop what you're doing, think about it, and then, keep going on this other path.
Yeah, I like keep going. You could look at it from many different levels, right? It could be like keep going into oblivion, or it's like you're working on the wrong thing at that point where you're illustrating this is pointless and you need to like take all of the learnings from that like trail behind you and apply them to something else. So there's some level of nuance that is lost in visualizing some of these concepts for sure. They're like affirmed by survivorship bias in many cases too, right? Like you put that out there and everybody that's experienced that can kind of self-select into saying, yes, this worked for me. So I think the nature of social networks in particular is like there's definite double-edged sword there too, where the like the desire to appeal more broadly actually takes you away from the potential upside. I think that upside is illustrated, like, I don't think it necessarily means reach. It could mean this like degree of resonance you have with the thing that you're doing that converts into like non-scalable opportunities. I experienced like you could plot that same graph over my design career where you're doing this, like you have this very, very linear experience up to a point, and then you gather enough experience to hone in on a problem that a lot of people have, and you can create connections virtually to a lot of people through something like a Twitter. And that opportunity to work on a project or produce a product that is going to resonate with a very specific type of person becomes like obvious in hindsight. So I think there's definitely like there's two sides to it. One is like you have to listen to the feedback you're getting. I don't think just keep going is necessarily, well, just keep going, keep putting work out, I would say is not bad advice. But if you're not listening, it's definitely bad advice, if that makes sense. Like, you're not listening to how things are being received, then you're not making the adjustments you need to get closer to something that resonates. I think there's there's a 50 Cent quote about this. It says, if you're not getting a response, like you're being told something loud and clear, you're just not listening. And I think I've written reasonably extensively about this, where like the ability for you to do things permissionlessly on the internet is very different than it was even 10 years ago, where a network like Twitter didn't have, the types of people it has now that wake up every day and check their Twitter feed. Being a graphic designer, very specific, like to give a really specific example, like working on things that you wish existed or you wish you could collaborate with someone on. One tangible example of this for me was Naval Ravikant. A lot of his ideas like really resonated with me when I was transitioning from agency to product business, and a lot of those ideas actually like just illuminated a different direction for the visualized value business. In like permissionlessly posting all of those things, I ended up getting a gig illustrating his book. Not something that would have happened without not something I could have just applied for on the fly. I don't think the network, putting work into the network, began to just create really specific types of opportunities. So I think like the luck and work debate is very it's kind of contentious, and also like you're really arguing over definitions of words more than anything. There is definitely there are definitely people that start in much more advantageous positions than others, depending on what what the outcome or the goal is. But there's also all of this like incalculable, butterfly effect craziness going on around that stuff too. So I definitely subscribe to the, it's possible to increase your luck surface area and go out and do things permissionlessly and put work out into the world, while acknowledging that not everybody, not everybody's even exposed to the information that would help them realize that that's possible. Like the luck for me was that my cousin was interested in this thing, and he, happened to mention it to me. I happened to remember. Who knows what I'd be doing if I didn't like ask my mom, hey, is Brett still working at that place? That one little thing, and then probably dozens and dozens of things before that also contribute to those things. So long-winded answer. Keep going. I believe in it, but there's also a lot of nuance to it.
Yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of the butterfly effect concept. Whenever I start thinking about like these little things like that had they not happened, where would I be? How would things be different? It's just like mind blowing. I just can't wrap my head around it.
Right. Yeah, it's like on another timeline, you're, it's hard to even use language to describe those things. It's just unfathomable, the combination of options. And if you step out into the road at the wrong time, obviously your life would be totally different as well. It's just it's a pretty fascinating thing. And like any level of conviction, I think just speaks to a little bit of inexperience. There's so much nuance to it, and there's so many there's a lot of talented people that just don't get on in the right environment, or don't get exposed to the right piece of information. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to do with visualized value too, is just try and bring some of those ideas, concepts, even just like mental frames for experimentation, open-mindedness, because I think being open to the possibility of X is going to drastically increase the chance that you put yourself in an environment that helps you learn the thing or do the thing or meet the person that's going to change your circumstances.
Yeah, it's I think one of the things that's also really interesting to me is like, we spend, myself included, obviously a lot of time usually and thought on these decisions that we regard as being important in life, right? Like the one, moving to New York for you, for example, like it's probably sort of a big decision. You might have made it pretty quickly at the pub, but
Right.
it seems like that type of decision, that size of decision is the one that sometimes we can make quickly, but oftentimes we spend sort of quite a bit of time and energy and thought on. But really, like it could be that the most impactful decision in your life, and I'm just speculating. Obviously,
Yeah, of
this isn't
course.
the case, but it may have been just asking your mom if your cousin was still doing what he was doing,
Right,
which you
right.
didn't even think twice about. You just sort of like said it or whatever.
And it
Uh,
all depends on what you like, what you mean in terms of significance. Like, how are you measuring that? Because there's also crazy amounts of sacrifice that go with any significant decision. Is like saying no to 100 million other possibilities, right?
yeah, totally. All right. So coming back a little bit from the philosophical, I'm coming back to what you're doing today with with visualized value. You mentioned sort of at the point, where it started to take off, you or maybe a little bit beyond that point, you started to get more clients than you could handle. And I think a traditional minded person might say, okay, time to raise the prices. But you said, okay, time to change the business model. Walk me through like, when you hit that point, you're like probably doing pretty well. You don't even need to necessarily change anything. You could say, all right, great. I'm full of clients. I've got a good business going. Let's keep doing it. Or you could raise the prices, or you could sort of, audible and seek to do this different thing, which, I'm sure it was less common when you started than it is now to sort of seek, leverage and,
Mm-hmm.
create all these, evergreen things online for people to consume. It's even, now I'm sure it'll be more popular in 5 years than it is today. So how did you sort of arrive at that conclusion and start to bring that all to fruition?
So I mentioned Naval in the last answer. I think always got to give a hat tip to the concepts in that tweet storm, how to get rich without getting lucky. And the only world I knew from when I was a kid, my whole childhood, I was told like get a good job, a well-paying job with X, Y, and Z, like longevity, like basically minimize risk in that sense, right? Find somebody that's gonna pay you well, and don't enter anything that's too tumultuous, risky, volatile, etc. And then went into a career in advertising where it's time and materials based. You spend this. I always thought that there was a huge conflict of interest here. Like advertising agencies charge their clients by the hour, and it's like, well, that's kind of the opposite incentive structure that should be in place, right? Our incentive is to spend as long as we possibly can on this thing as a company, which makes very little sense. And just not being exposed to technology, and even though I was building websites, it's kind of strange to look back now and not really didn't really have a grasp on the internet, or the internet economy, I should say, until I started to work by myself and start to think about, or started to even experience, like, it doesn't really matter how good my work is if I'm not able to position it in a way that is bringing me like the exact type of person I want to work with, then it just doesn't seem to be like so much energy was being wasted. That's what I felt like. I was like building this portfolio website up. I was making like Instagram profiles with all of these, like, in my opinion, great pieces of work that I've produced and like labored over for hours and hours, years and years. And it just didn't, there's no connection to people in the same way. I think that's another like retroactive observation, is like I was working with corporations at a size where you're dealing with somebody who is not the principal of the business, right? You're just dealing with a middle manager in a company that has 10,000 employees. And although you can build great relationships and make great work, it doesn't, again, you just never really learn like you're kind of abstracted from the fundamentals of business. You're so many layers away. I remember asking questions in a lot of project meetings and just like trying to get down to like, okay, what's the actual objective here? What's the number we're trying to hit, or X, Y, or Z? And there's a lot of there was just a lot of kind of smoke and mirrors, or like, somebody has one mandate, the department next to them has another mandate. As long as they kind of leave each other alone, they just, just trying to get through the day. And that like experience I had when I became a sole proprietor or owned my own company, I was responsible for a P&L. I was like, okay, now I really understand why this is not going to be like, short of like me staying up more hours, like I can't make any more money. I could hire people. Yes, I've worked in like really lean, amazing agencies, but all these service businesses, it's hard to imagine an example of a service business that gets more efficient by adding people. Kind of by definition, the opposite happens. So that realization first led me down the like, okay, let's specialize route. And then secondarily was like, okay, this is like, there's clearly a demand for this thing. And I need to identify what it is people are interested in. And I think this may not even be the final realization, but what I realize is people are interested in like the ability to communicate in a simpler, clearer, more compelling way. So they can either hire me to do that. Obviously, there's only so many people I can do that for, or I can train people to build that skill. And that was like the realization that led to product. And I can't even take credit for realizing that by myself, because people started asking me for it on Twitter where I was posting stuff. So it really I think there's a Mark Andreessen quote. I think it's Mark Andreessen says, creativity is a collaboration between the creator and the audience. And when you're on a platform like Twitter, where the audience isn't, a boardroom of people that have different, incentives that don't necessarily align with yours. It's just a bunch of people that want stuff, that want to try and buy things, learn things. I think that led me down the path of creating these education products initially that people just want to build that same skill set. And then, from there, I just started to figure out how to refine the ability to transmit those lessons. And that's a constant process. I don't think, it's not necessarily done the first time you do it. You can continue to refine it and learn from everybody that goes through the process, and obviously improve your own skills and put the things that you learn from continuing to practice back into the curriculums you produce. And I think there's obviously a lot of different ways you can use technology to break the relationship between your time and your income. But for me specifically, it was really just identifying that this is a skill or an ability that I think a lot of people would benefit from. And you don't have to be a designer. You don't have to, this is something that is more broadly applicable than people who work in design departments of agencies or wherever. It's something that everybody can use. So there's obviously more people you can serve that way.
Yeah, and I think the messages that you're communicating through your visuals or the like, through tweets, anything, they're pretty like high level, right? Like you said, it's not just for like graphic designers. It's at a pretty high level where people who specifically are in all sorts of niches like can probably benefit from these sort of general nuggets of wisdom or what you may. And you sort of, I imagine, had to at some point transition to, coming up with these messages. I know some of them are, quotes from others like Naval, or, there's a bunch of people that you've quoted and created graphics, about their quote for in the past. But a lot of these messages I think are original. And that's not something that you've been doing for 15 years. Like for the vast majority of that time, I think you were sort of working on some kind of mandate, and maybe they didn't give you the
Mhm.
exact copy and you had some freedom to, take a messy message and make it clean and clear and succinct. But you sort of graduated this place probably within the last few years or so, where it was sort of on you to bring a message out of thin air, from 0 to 1, come up with the idea, come up with the best way to communicate the idea, come up with the visual to illustrate that idea, and then, maybe package it on how best to share it. Um, I'm curious, like, is there anything you do to help sort of systematically get that process going, and that idea generation machine sort of keeping it well oiled, or spark it when you feel like you're in a rut or anything like that?
Yeah, there's a few things. The first is it is remarkably similar to like physical training. Like when I first started doing it, I could do 5, 6 a day. And it's almost like I'm not a neurologist. I don't know how any of this stuff works, but it's almost like the kind of neural pathways that help you translate things to visuals just get kind of bedded in, and you start seeing stuff everywhere. Or you'll read a sentence and you can kind of pull out the logic from it and then think about a way to add add some visual context to the statement. I think that's one piece of it. And then the second piece is like trying to make it an output of my like continued experience, or like as I try and evolve what visualized value is, or what I know, or what I put out into the world, all of those experiences and the things that I need to read and understand to take the business to the next stage are all like kind of truths that are being tested in real time, like understanding how like leverage has been such a huge component, where there's like this dance between what you're learning and implementing, and then how you translate that back into, it's kind of like documenting the realizations that you're having in real time. So that's another like if I get stuck, it's normally because either I'm not like reading new material, I'm not like curious about something in particular, or I'm not pursuing something with a view to learning something from it. As soon as I get into that mode, it all starts flowing naturally again. So it's just trusting that your curiosity is going to lead you to a place where there's going to be something worth sharing. That's like about as tactical as it gets. I definitely keep things where like if I read something and I can't like read or write something and I can't quite come up with the visual solution for it then and there, I'll write it down, have a running list, and then some days I'll come back to that list and it will jump out, or something gets defragged while you go to sleep overnight and you just wake up and an idea pops up. So it's reasonably organic, but I try and keep track of a lot of it too. And that's like with the speed at which the world moves, it's like there's always new material and new things to it's funny, there's like this weird paradox where everything changes but nothing changes, so you're kind of using these principles that you've illustrated or thought a lot about to just continually communicate a similar thing in a different way. I would say somebody actually built a database of all the visuals and tagged the themes of a lot of the visuals, and there's dozens and dozens of themes, but you do start to notice there are there are things that begin to overlap, like ideas that are common in areas of like self-reflection. Like it's, for example, the idea of perspective, looking at a thing or a situation from a different vantage point. You can portray that visually in lots of different ways. It may resonate really heavily with a certain person one way and a different person another way. So that's the other, I think, forgiving thing about this format is it's not like this is like V1, V2, V3, V4 versus like 0 to 1 every single time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of these concepts are sort of building on each other, and I saw the archive. I think it's archive.visualizevalue.com, if that's right. And
That's the one.
had the
Archive with two
double,
V's. That's
yeah,
the
the
one.
double V was pretty cool on the archive. So was that wasn't something that you led? That was someone else came in and did that?
Yeah. So one of the courses is called Permissionless Apprentice, and it talks a lot about a lot of what we discussed in the first half of this conversation. Um, and yeah, the guy's name's Pierce, and he just messaged me on Twitter and said, "Hey, I built this thing. What do you think?" And I was like, "Yeah, this is badass." We like went back and forth and sent a few login details over and tweaked a couple bits, and then went live. That's happened a couple times. A couple people have built apps with visualized value content. One of the planner tools that I designed a few years ago, someone turned into a iOS app. There's a lot of cool permissionless stuff that has come out of just consistently publishing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're teaching a class called Permissionless Apprentice, you can expect to get a few permissionless apprentices of your own. I saw, people not only turning your products into apps and things, but I saw people getting tattoos with some of your visuals.
Yeah,
So some
yeah,
pretty cool stuff going on.
that's
Um,
surreal. That is
I, I
surreal.
I know we're coming up on time here, but I appreciate all the time you spent. I want to wrap things up. Thanks again, Jack, for coming on and joining me. It's really, really interesting conversation and really enjoyed it. Where can people go and follow you and your journey? Visualizevalue.com, I'm sure. Anywhere else, anything new you want to point people to?
Yeah, I think Twitter is the best place to catch anything that might be going on. So at Jack Butcher for me, and at Visualize Value for Visualize Value. And yeah, I got a couple different newsletters you can get to via visualizevalue.com if you're interested in learning more. And then all of the products that we talked about, you can find there as well.